Howdy, y'all. So today we have Dr. Jenny Root and Dr. Sarah Cox. Dr. Sarah Cox, would you mind introducing yourself first?
Absolutely. My name is Sarah Cox. I am an assistant professor at Eastern Michigan University, and I teach primarily in the area of autism spectrum disorders and mathematics, teaching students about mathematics. My background, I was a general education math teacher in an inclusive setting, mostly middle school. So that is kind of what led my interest in this area.
Awesome. Dr. Jenny Root, would you mind introducing yourself next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jenny Root. I'm an associate professor of special ed at Florida State University. I teach courses in a variety of degree programs related to accessing the general curriculum for students with moderate to severe disabilities, transition, applied behavior analysis, and then doctoral courses in research methods. My research focuses on how to teach math to students with more extensive support needs and how to support teachers in doing that. And my drive and why I do this is because I myself don't feel comfortable in teaching math. And I didn't as a classroom teacher. I taught middle school special ed in inclusive and self-contained settings. And I don't feel like I was very well prepared to teach grade aligned math. I knew how to teach functional skills. And I want other teachers who maybe also don't feel super confident and prepared to have more tools in their toolbox for how to teach students the skills that they can learn.
Amazing. Okay, so Dr. Jenny Root, I'm going to have the first question go to you. We have so much vernacular and language in education, right? And we love to throw around acronyms and we confuse everyone. But one of the reoccurring confusions is around our language about like approaches to instruction. So we see direct instruction with a capital D, capital I. We see direct instruction used with a small d, small I. And then we also see the term explicit instruction. So can you like give us a really quick explanation for how these terms relate to one another and how they're a little bit different?
Sure. It totally makes sense that there's confusion when we say, big DI and little DI and explicit instruction, and they are related. So big DI, meaning our capital D, capital I, was coined by Zig Engelman in the 1960s. And the bottom line is that it refers to an explicit, carefully sequenced and scripted curricula. So that's going to be published curricula where teachers follow a script and it's already been carefully sequenced and laid out for you. Those are typically done in published in math and in reading. And there are 4 features of those that are kind of common. So those programs, students take a placement test. So their students are placed at their instructional level and then they progress through. So they don't move forward until they've met mastery. The program is structured to ensure students meet mastery. Instruction is modified to accommodate students' rate of learning. So they aren't sort of kept with the whole class and the class doesn't move together. Students are intended to move based on their own rate of learning. And the programs are field tested. So there's research behind them before publication. But the big thing to know is Big DI is a scripted published curriculum. Little DI was coined by Brock Rosenshine, and it refers to instructional variables that are related to student achievement. So these are things like students being engaged, presenting new material in small steps, frequently checking for student understanding, and if there's not understanding, correcting those misunderstandings. And you do that by having students actively participating and responding so that you can check that understanding. And he called these principles of instruction. So Big DI incorporates all of these principles of instruction, but it's done for you. My mentor, Diane Browder, calls this takeout, right? So it's already there in the box or in the manual for teachers. Little DI, you can think of it as you might cook from scratch, or it's your recipe that you follow in order to make sure all these principles of instruction are there. Anita Archer and Charles Hughes, who the Archer and Hughes book I love, uses the term explicit instruction. And while we could talk about some like fine-grained differences between little DI and explicit instruction, I see them as pretty much similar. And it helps us avoid that big DI, little DI difference. And they chose that word explicit because they're saying it's an unambiguous and direct approach to teaching that includes both instructional design, so your recipe, what you intend to do, and your delivery, so how you actually go about cooking it. And what is served. So little DI or explicit instruction is your method of design and delivery, not a curriculum.
Amazing. I think that was a very helpful clarification for us. And I'm actually going to pop back to you, Dr. Root. You mentioned some of these already, but what do you see as the active ingredients that make explicit instruction beneficial for learners?
So Archer and Hughes would have 16 of these elements. I'm not going to go through those, but I do have to pop in their book again is a wonderful, wonderful resource for anyone who's interested. But I think it's important that we first look at the underlying principles of effective instruction as far as what it intends to do, right? So the intention behind explicit instruction is that you're optimizing engaged time and time on task. I always come back to the quote by Bill Heward, where he says, instructional time is a precious commodity, right? Like we only have so much of it and we should highly value it. And then I also like to tie in a quote from Twitter that someone said where people who are drowning don't have time to perfect their strokes, right? So for our learners with disabilities who are struggling in math, that productive struggle is not productive. Right. And so we need to optimize how much time our students are on task, promote high levels of success, cover as much content as we can in the time that we have. And then we can do that by having students in small groups that are grouped intentionally, scaffolding instruction and addressing multiple types of knowledge, the lower level recall all the way up through applying. And we do that through having different types of supports, and making sure students are successful in a way that our instruction is most effective and efficient as possible.
That's amazing. One of the common critiques that I often hear of explicit instruction is it's a set and get model. So they view, and I sometimes think this is a straw man argument, but they'll say students just sit there and they're very passive. So I don't know, Sarah or Jenny, if you have any feedback on why that is kind of a mischaracterization of explicit instruction.
So I would say that you're doing it wrong. If students are sitting there, you're not doing it, you're not following the recipe. That's not the active ingredients, because in fact, a key component is high frequency of responses. So if you go through the active ingredients that Rosenshine first outlined, we're beginning with a review of prerequisite skills and knowledge. So you're immediately getting students to respond to make sure you're checking in with what they know. And then you're going in with presenting material in small steps and modeling with examples and non-examples. And I think a really common misconception is that modeling piece is the teacher doing everything, where it's really, I like to think of it, I like the word lead more, where it's the teacher leading things, but the students need to be actively responding and engaging and repeating. And then that guided practice is supposed to have a high frequency of responses, because you're supposed to do that guided practice until students are starting to become fluent. And how will you know if they're fluent if they're not responding? Mm-hmm. And then the independent practice, you should be continually monitoring. So I just don't think it can be done correctly if the students aren't actively engaged.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I know there's a lot of people who do work in this area suggest like, hey, we need like roughly 5 opportunities to respond per minute for all students in the class. And obviously when we shift to more fluency building, we might want to see like 10, 11, 12 opportunities to respond per minute, depending on the focus of the instruction. Sarah, I'm going to pop over to you. What are some of the common critiques that you hear about explicit instruction besides the set and get, which I guess I kind of just stole your thunder? And which do you think are invalid? And do you think there are any that are valid that we should honestly consider?
This is a really great question. So I agree completely with what you and Jenny have said. I think that this misconception that explicit instruction is a sit and get. Another way I've heard people phrase that is it's teacher centered. And I agree that if you are watching a lesson that you believe to be explicit instruction, or the teacher believes it to be explicit instruction, and the students are not actively engaged, then the implementation fidelity is inaccurate, right? They're not doing it the way that it is meant to be done. I would say that some of the other critiques would be that it tends to focus on the procedural part of mathematics. And again, I would argue that it's not being done correctly, because explicit instruction talks about making things clear and concise for the students, which would include incorporating both the procedural and the conceptual components of mathematics, because we know that this is an iterative nature in terms of students developing their knowledge base. So we need to rely on both of these things and develop both of those pieces of knowledge for the students in order for them to be really successful in math. So again, I would argue that it's not explicit instruction necessarily that is a critique for. It is how we are implementing explicit instruction. And then the last argument that I often hear against the use of explicit instruction would be that it only stays at that first level of learning, that we really hammer in the acquisition phase, and that we don't really get into fluency as much, and that we very rarely touch upon maintenance and or generalization of learning. And again, I would argue that that is not inherent to explicit instruction, but instead how we are using it. We absolutely can use explicit instruction effectively to teach students to be more fluent in mathematics. We can absolutely use it to help promote maintenance and generalization to some degree. So I think that, again, if there is an argument that has some validity to it, I think maybe this idea that we don't always use explicit instruction as effectively to promote these other areas of math. I don't think we have as much research to say that it's very effective to promote maintenance and generalization, at least not as much as we have to support its effectiveness for acquisition and fluency. So I would say that would be the one that we could look closer at, and that we could really push ourselves to make sure that we are using it to push students beyond that acquisition and fluency phase.
Great. And Sarah, I have another question for you. So when we think about maybe explicit instruction serving as maybe the bedrock of our instructional approach, at what stages or when would you think about perhaps using instructional practices that might align a little bit more with inquiry-based approaches? So if we start getting involved with maybe project-based learning, or more less guided approaches to instruction?
Absolutely. So I'm really glad you asked this question, because I do think that often in our fields, we hear this dichotomy of you are either using direct instruction or explicit instruction, or you are using a more, student-centered, inquiry-based approach. And there are many scholars that would argue that it doesn't have to be quite that dichotomous, that you can incorporate elements of both when you're working with students. But I'll go back to what Jenny said about if you have a student who is drowning and they need help keeping afloat, then that's where the bulk of our instruction should be focused on. So when we have students who are still acquiring these skills and they're still learning to be fluent in them, then I think that leaning more heavily on those instructional approaches that align with explicit instruction makes more sense. We're getting the students to become proficient. We're getting them to be confident and secure in their use of those mathematical skills and knowledge. And then if we present them with something that's a more inquiry-based approach, then they have that background knowledge to really be successful in that inquiry-based approach, and they can be more efficient and effective. Whereas if we don't give them those prerequisite skills first, and we ask them to engage in this experiment that is essentially just going to frustrate them, it's going to further pound that water on top of their heads and make them feel like they're drowning.
Great. And Sarah, I actually have one follow-up question. As a general education teacher, right, thinking back to your time doing that, which I was a general education teacher also, how did you attempt to balance students in your class who might be ready to move past as much teacher guidance or explicitness, and we're ready to perhaps tackle things independently?
Absolutely. So I think, again, this is where that classroom management of grouping and using your resources really comes into play. So, and of course, reliance on data. So when I was in my undergraduate degree, I don't think I realized how scientific teaching is, and understanding that we can use that data and our observations of the students and where they're at to make those instructional decisions. So for me, what I would often do was use those explicit instruction principles to lead the whole group lesson, and then, very strategically group students and decide on that day, is it going to be more heterogeneous where, I can target certain groups who might need more of a push or who might need more support? Or is it going to be a heterogeneous day where I have students with different skill sets who are working together to kind of help each other along in this process?
Great. And I think there's a quote, I don't remember who says this all the time, but there's this idea that learning is one of the most predictable things we have when we know the instruction, if we're using data well, right? And that's like one thing that if we're using data well, we can then better inform the instructional approach and the content we're targeting to specific students. Well, this has been amazing, y'all. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.